Here we go. Welcome to the Desire Line. I'm Jess Finley.
And I'm James Riley. Desire line is a metaphor for the experience of fencing indes and for our intention to let the conversation topic dictate the direction it takes.
Here in this show, we're going to be discussing the experience of being human as viewed through the lens of the art of historical fencing. At least, that's what we think.
And how are you, Jess?
I'm doing great. I've had a good week. Since we last talked, I was able to get a whole lot more done on my big sewing project, which is reworking my arming coat so that when I fight in armor coming up soon, I'll have that ready to go. So, how about you? What you been up to?
Well, just kind of same. I'm working down in Chicago right now, and it's a trip, and it's COVID and all this stuff. It's still kind of going on. Trying to make live music performance happen and as much as it's possible, and it's been a challenge, but that's kind of been what my week has consisted of. So
Yeah, dude, I mean, for real, I fantasize about COVID being over soon.
yeah, I don't know something. I don't know. Anyway, all right, so let's talk about historical fencing. Let's talk about how we might begin to think about historical fencing.
Yeah. Well, okay. So last week we talked about story begetting state, right? And I was really thinking about like one of the most pivotal moments for me related to historical fencing, where this really like just was thrown in my face. And so it was at one of the Surfos. I can't remember what year it was. But for whatever reason, that year I was working the table, and Keith Cotter Riley was running the ring, and there were two people fencing. I don't even remember who was fencing. And so this exchange happens between the fencers, like bop, 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 bop. Somebody gets hit. Maybe they both get hit. I don't really remember the specifics of the exchange. But what I remember is me sitting at the table. I have like basically the best view of the action, right? And I see what happens. And I take my pencil and glance down to prepare to mark who I saw win that exchange. And Keith calls the point for the other person, and then proceeds to explain the fencing exchange he saw, right? Like he outlines, this is what happened. This person tried this, it went this way, that happened, this person got hit, point them, right? And I was like flabbergasted because I saw completely different intentions from those fencers. And because I had written the story of what they were trying to do, I had seen the result through a different lens, and had assumed, one person had the point, one person had the afterblow, or maybe I saw it as a double, or I don't know what it was, right? It doesn't matter. But the point is that like, I've worked with Keith a ton. He's one of the best ring bosses I've ever seen. Our interpretations of fencing are in no way different that we've really run it up into, right? Other than he focuses Meyer and I focus Early. But like, I've never had a disagreement with him on fencing. But in that moment, we told completely different stories about that exchange and what each person was trying to do. And that changed what we saw as the result. Mind-blowing.
Sure. And that makes me think of, well, a couple of things. One, it really highlights probably, if not the singularly principal issue that we're dealing with in historical fencing, or in any kind of fencing, any kind of armed combat training, right? If not the most important, certainly among the most important, which is that any kind of fencing is a simulation, right? And when I say simulation,
Oh.
what I mean is there's a sense in which like all combat sports are a simulation, right? So like boxing is a simulation, right? It's a simulation of some hypothetical, theoretical street fight, or whatever. Like, I don't know what boxers tell themselves about what they're doing. I think most elite boxers probably tell themselves they're boxing, right?
Yeah.
But you know, but when we talk about fencing, right, it's written into the DNA of fencing that what we're doing is we're simulating what circumstances would be if the tools that we were using, right, the weapons, were sharp, were meant to cause harm to our opponent. And I don't mean that like we all always need to think about fencing as a sort of approximation of some kind of martial combat. All I mean by that is when we create the rules of our exchanges, we create the shared expectations of what we're doing. We always have to account for what it is we want, or how it is that we want to simulate this sort of theoretical thing, right? Are we just doing it to the touch? Are we doing it to like a what we would regard as a martial thrust or whatever? All of these are valid ways of approaching the question. But the bottom line is they're only ever approximations. They can only be approximations of some idea about how we want to approximate or how we want to simulate what armed combat would be, right? And so because of that, it gets even more muddy, right?
Yeah.
So for instance, if it was MMA, an exchange, judges see fights differently all the time, right? They, two judges judging the same scorecard will often award the round to the other fighter, right? But when someone gets knocked out, then it's clear what happened, right? Like the person is knocked out, the other person wins the fight, right?
Right.
That's never true with fencing, right?
No.
It's never true with fencing, because even when it's the clearest, even when the exchange seems to be as obvious, and it's still possible that someone missed some part of the action that would have resulted in a score and nullified everything that came after that. And so,
Yeah.
and because it's not, it's not something where, hopefully it's not something where anyone can get hurt, right? The fencer might not have even felt it, right? Like they might not have even known the thing happened. That happens all the time too. So that's what when you bring that point up, it definitely speaks to me. Like that's such a illustrative point.
Right. And because we can't and shouldn't aspire to, in my opinion, right? Knockouts or injuries being what ends the fight. I don't ever want to show up for that. What that means then is the only way to judge it is based on story.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so therefore, this highlights so many experiences we have seen where we'll often say, oh, the more experienced fencers are better judges and better ring bosses. Why?
Right.
Do they have better eyes? No.
Sure.
Right? They don't have better eyes. But because we're all living in our brain's simulation of the world, and through prediction, if I see somebody flip their sword to the flat before they begin to throw their blow, I'm already assuming they're going sphere, right?
Mm-hmm.
If that's the initial thing I see, like I've already decided they're going to sphere. So when I see something that looks like a sphere,
sure,
I'm not going to question that that's what came out, right?
Sure.
Whereas someone who has maybe less experience has less ability to predict what's about to happen. Therefore, they get lost in the weeds of the motion.
Sure. So their map isn't sophisticated enough to be able to perceive all of the sort of most granular levels of detail that they're seeing. So I'm talking about like the more inexperienced fencer, right?
Yeah.
Even though they're physically, or they're the same bits of information are flying at their face, right?
Right.
The,
They are
the-
perceiving the same.
right, right. And so it's about story. Yeah, I like that a lot. So, and the other thing that tells me is that when we say the experienced fencers are better judges, um, there's no real measurable, or at least quantitative way to assess that, right? Like the only way that so it's not an assessment to say the experienced fencers are better judges, um, and therefore we want them to judge. It's more like we like the story that those fencers can tell or can see unfold, and so that's our criteria for
Yeah.
your fencing, right? So our
Yeah.
criteria is that your fencing approximates the vision in their mind of what good fencing looks like.
Oh no. Yeah, you just opened some shit up right there. Right? Because yeah, for sure. You know, a really good easy example would be, do you count slop?
Hmm. For sure, for sure. And and the answer to that would be like, well, do you see slop? Or to what level of detail do you see the contrast, right?
Right. Right. And you know, that goes into the question of context of what you're doing. Are you yeah, are you trying to create good fencing, i.e. the you hit the person with the sword at the tempo you want, in the tempo you want, with the edge you want, blah 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 blah,
Right,
right? Being good fencing, right? Whatever that means.
right, right, right.
Or did shit happen and you accidentally hit them and that would have cut them in real life? So I guess we take it.
Sure, right, and that's the other
Right?
thing that we have to. That's the other thing that we have to. We're confronted with when we
Yeah.
accept the fact. When we accept the fact that whenever we're fencing, we're trying to achieve this thing. Like we're making decisions about what it is that we're looking for,
Yeah.
right? Um, then we might decide that the way that we want to think about what we're looking for looks like X versus Y, and in some cases it's a valid approach to say, no, if you get hit at all, then that's not good fencing, you shouldn't let it happen, or whatever, right? And then um and so we base our criteria off that. Or another criteria would be, no, I want what you're doing to clearly represent good fencing from my perspective, right?
Yeah.
Which is sort of the approach that I've taken, especially in the last 4 or 5 years. Like I've been very disinterested in the alternative, right? The former, the idea that any fencing that results in a hit, clean hit or otherwise, is good fencing. And that's interesting, because that actually gets me to a topic that I wanted to talk about,
Yeah.
it's both related to fencing, but it's also related to just like mindset when we're trying to perceive information, right? So so we talk about Fühlen, and we're going to talk about Fühlen like all the time, right?
All day,
indes
every
and
day.
yeah, all day every day, right? So what we aspire to is to fence indes, we'll say,
Yeah.
right? So and for me, that is the metric by which, and the qualitative metric by which I assess fencing as either good or bad, right? Was the person acting indes? Did they? And so what does it mean to act indes, and what does it mean to fence with Fühlen, right? So there's two things. There's two ways that we can treat the Fühlen question, right? So like one is sort of our ability to perceive our opponent's behavior, and respond within their actions, respond with the correct action with the correct counteraction, in the correct space of time along the time continuum, right? At the correct speed, etc. Right? So like that would be, and there are all sorts of ways that we can think about that. Like, what does it mean to feel? What does it mean to process data that we're getting using our bodies, using our vision, using our sort of predictive sense of what's happening, right? So there's that aspect of Fühlen. But then there's a separate aspect of Fühlen that I want to unpack a little bit, right? Which is this idea that what we need to work indes is to be present. Okay. So
Okay. All right.
So
like in the Zen sense, like Buddhist.
Well, kinda, right?
Right.
Well,
Okay.
so yeah, no, we can definitely go down that road for sure, right? So
right, because like some people would like start throwing in OODA loops right now, or some people would start throwing in Buddhism right now, or some people. So I just like, where are you
right.
living?
Well, so I'll tell you what brought this up. We're teaching class. I was teaching class on Wednesday, and we were doing. I think we began with some footwork stuff, right? Or it's just like a basic blade action along with some footwork, and my student was finding it difficult to maintain their balance throughout the entire action, right? And it was interesting because I felt like I could see what was happening that was causing them to lose their balance, right?
Yeah.
And what it was they were operating like up here. Okay. So like they were consciously thinking of what their body was doing, but they weren't present in their body. Right? They were like directing their body from above.
Yeah.
Right? And so, what it required was to be able to sort of operate in a I mean, you brought up Buddhism, right? So like to operate in like in a present way that's sort of like antithetical to the Western model of like spiritual and physical dualism, right? So like in Buddhism, right, we don't contrast like the spiritual and physical realities, right?
Right.
It's a very Western, right, Greek sort of way of thinking about the world, and that sort of felt like what was happening in that moment is that like they were consciously up here and their body was physically down here, and they were like trying to like direct, and they just weren't all here, right?
Yeah.
And so when I say present, that's kind of where I'm going with that.
Okay.
Sort of like, does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah. No, and I think a lot of us, because of the way most of us, if you went through American public school, I guess I can't speak to anything else, but that many of us were educated. We were educated to get out of our bodies. Our bodies are meat shells sitting at our desk doing nothing.
Yeah.
And you need to get out. You need to get out because that's where higher is.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. And where does that come from? Right. That has its roots in Western philosophy going like all the way back, or at least
way back.
Yeah.
Right.
Thanks,
sure. Plato.
Yeah, really. Yeah. He started it. So yeah. So and
seems
and,
a little early to throw Plato under the bus as a podcast, but I mean, why not? We'll come back and love him later.
You might
a little bit.
Won't. I have my quibbles with. No, that's not true. I like Plato. So all right. So now we've got that part of Fühlen, right? Which for me is like this idea that we're trying to synergize like mind and spirit. If we're even going to make that, if we're going to approach it from that dualistic perspective, that we're trying to synergize body and spirit, right?
Is this the embodiment idea that we talked about?
Well, I don't know. I mean, so embodiment is a tricky concept
Yeah.
because it means a lot of things for a lot of different people, right? And especially in historical fencing, do you mean and anthropological embodiment, right? Or do you just mean sort of embodiment of your sort of, do you mean what I'm talking about, right? Like,
I
that's
think
really,
I mean what you're talking about.
I think so too, and I hope so, because that's the way that I would use the term. That's sort of what I would strive for, at least, in terms of Fühlen,
Yeah.
right? Is to try and be aware with more than just, my mind looking down and directing my meat shell, right? So there's that, right? But then the other thing about being present, and the reason that we don't want to be up in the clouds looking down at what we're experiencing, is because that takes time, right? That takes processing power, that we have to translate and then retranslate, and all of that, you're losing your ability to tether yourself to things as they're happening.
Yeah.
Right. And so that gets me to, like, or that's sort of where I'm at with Fühlen. It's just this idea that we're able to perceive things as they're happening, and
Right.
work within them. Right. And go ahead.
Dude, it just, no, everything you're saying is reminding me of taking horsemanship lessons. And like, here's what happens. Here's what I experience. Because I'm still so new at that. It's easy for me to do what you're talking about. So
Sure.
I can describe it like from a newbie experience, which is whatever. I'm riding the horse is trotting, or whatever. I ask the horse to trot, right? And so it starts, and I'm like, yeah, we're trotting. And then I'm like, where are my feet? Aren't my feet supposed to be in this position here? Because that's what's good. Oh shit. And then the trot is all fucked up. Right? Because I went from I am here in the rhythm to where are my pieces? And I start messing with my pieces, and then everything's gone. And it happens like that. But it is that sense of, here I am. Oh, wait a minute. And then it's gone.
Yeah, exactly. You lose it because you need that connection to stay with it, right? So it's like you get distracted, but I want to be clear about what the distraction is, right? Because when we think of like getting distracted, so let's say you get distracted in a fencing bout. If I tell a brand new fencer, like, hey, don't get distracted, right? Then they'll, it's possible that the way that they interpret that is, don't focus on what's going on over there with those other people. Don't focus on what's going on outside or what I have coming up later today.
Yeah.
Right. And what I'm really saying is, no, don't focus on the bout. Don't focus on the bout, right? Feel the bout, be present in the bout, right? Don't get sort of lost in the details of what's happening intellectually.
Yeah.
Right. Because that's where we get lost, and that's what people get distracted by, right? Especially new fencers. They're thinking about the bout. How could they not? They've got swords coming at them, and right.
Yeah.
And you're thinking about your horse, right? It's not like you're all of a sudden worried about like who's going to pick up the kids or whatever. Like you're there, you're present, right? Except that you're not.
Right? Because you get lost in the storytelling.
Yeah. Right. That's really interesting.
Because you're trying to write the story of what's happening. And then fix shit about it you think is wrong if you're a little neurotic like me.
So I wonder, and so that raises the question then, should we're trying to write the story of what's happening. Is there a way that we can maintain that storytelling experience and still be present? Or should we strive to transcend that?
No, I think when we talk about flow state, I'm sure you've experienced flow state. You're a musician. You have to have.
Right. We've talked about it several times for sure.
Yeah. I think so. And certainly I have experienced those moments in a lot of places, but fencing moments that become that flow state really stand out to me. And there's no storytelling.
Yeah.
There's none in those moments. Because if storytelling is coming up here and watching and directing, for me, those moments of flow state are I just expand to take up the whole world. Right? My senses get gigantic and time goes slow.
For sure. Yeah.
And things just happen. You know, I think it was the last WMAW I was at. I was fencing Jesse Kula in armor. And he's awesome and amazing. And is a lot stronger than me. And there was a moment, for the rules of this, for anybody that doesn't know, that particular event, there was a door for the fencers to come in and out of. And if you got your opponent out that door, it was a win, right? But it's a very narrow area, and especially in armor, it's harder than one would think to drive somebody out this little door. So anyways, this whole wrestling moment came, a lot of things happened for the setup, which aren't clear to me now. But what I remember is he was pushing into me and I was like, I can't resist this. And I began to turn and everything went real slow. And I was like, oh, I can 180 and whip him out that door. I can just, whoosh. And it did. It worked exactly like that. And from his experience, he partway into that moment perceived what I was trying to do, knew it, and tried to redirect and couldn't, because I think because I was so deep in that, I was perceiving his attempts to redirect before he ever got to them. Right? Because otherwise it makes no sense. Like, again, Jesse could lift me with one bicep, right?
Sure.
So the fact that happened, the only way that happened was the magic of me existing and being present. And it wasn't until it was done that I fully understood it even worked. Though I knew it was going to.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So there's a couple of aspects to think about, to reflect on that story about.
Yeah.
Like, so the ability to perceive all of those things, right? That comes from experience, right? So it's not this, you know, to begin defense, it's being present is not something that you can just do right away, right? Like you have to go through stages of really just, or to me, stages of drawing a map of expectations, right? So like, what does it look like for him to just have a sword, like for him to just throw a strike at me, right? From any direction with any edge, you know, at any shoulder level, etc. Like all of those are finer and finer levels of detail that you become more and more equipped to be able to parse out, right? But you can't begin there. So and the higher the fidelity, right, the stronger your flow state, the slower time goes, right? The higher your fidelity of all of the various aspects of what you're experiencing, the more quickly you'll be able to see, respond, etc. Right? And so that's one thing. The other thing that we haven't really talked about, but the reason that I had brought it up, based on your initial story Begets State, right? And sort of like how those two fencers, how we're able to perceive information, how we're able to perceive things that are happening. It's not just that we need to take ourselves out of the clouds and put ourselves in our bodies, right? But we need to be able to relax, right?
Yeah.
So relaxation to me is probably the fundamental basis for all Fühlen. Okay, is the ability to relax, and the reason, or what I mean by relax, because I don't mean like relax could just mean like you flop, like you lose all muscular control and you just land on the floor, right? Like that could be relaxing.
I'm
So
just gonna
obviously
sleep here in Vom Tog. I'm just gonna chill out.
obviously I don't mean that, right? So, but what I
Right.
mean is that you're not engaging your body in a way that's sort of that doesn't that isn't a natural outgrowth of this flow state, of this shared
Mm-hmm.
flow state with you and your partner,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're not contracting muscles that you shouldn't contract.
Right.
So part of that
Like,
is learning. Go ahead.
yeah, I was gonna say like a wrestler getting stuck in stiff arming, right?
Exactly. Right.
Like if you're pushing somebody and you're shaking, I gotta keep them. You can't feel a damn thing other than you
Right.
pushing. That's all you can feel.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I talk about this, when two fencers, I mean, we've all been stuck there, right? And we're in a bind and we're contesting the bind, right?
Right.
Like there's both, and you can feel it. Anyone who's ever held swords, we'll say medieval weapons at least, right? Maybe not small swords or anything post small sword, but like a medieval weapon, anyone who's ever tried to bind has felt what it feels like when someone is contesting the bind, right?
Yeah.
When two fencers are putting pressure into each other, right? That is an expression of fencing without Fühlen, right? That right there, that moment is an expression of fencing without Fühlen. Now, that's not to say that one's a bad fencer if they do that or they experience that. They might just need to perceive that. It might take them a little while. They get to that perception and then they begin to respond, whatever the response is, right? Whether it be winding into their blade or coming off their blade or going under or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Whatever the correct way. But so that comes from learning, right? Being able to respond correctly comes from developing a sensibility about what the correct responses are to those types of actions, right?
Yeah.
And we've been given a map by historical fencing masters, right, that we are happy to follow. Certainly not the only way that one could frame or conceive of or even respond. Like there may be other techniques or things that we don't integrate into our personal fencing systems that work just fine in terms of achieving whatever contrived goals we decide are important.
Right.
Right. But the bottom line is, in order to achieve that level of perception,
Yeah.
it takes both mind and spirit. It takes a development of a framework, probably an intellectual development. Although I suppose that's not exactly true, because we've seen successful fencers who maybe can't articulate what they're doing, right? And
Absolutely.
even successful on our terms, right? Successful on our terms. People who just naturally achieve a quality of what we would regard as good fencing without ever having any way to frame it or any
for sure.
sort of mental map of how it works, right? But I would say that they, by definition, at least from my perspective, if they're good fencers, they are fencing with Fühlen, right? And they are working indes, right? So
Well, can we circle back for a half second to something you said? Because
Sure.
I think so. You said that we will be drawing our map as we're learning. I think that's what you said. Now I lost it because I got too interested in other things you were saying.
Sorry, I believe what you said is true, so I'm happy to start there.
All right. Well, we'll just accept you said that, and then the playback we'll see. But I think one thing that's fascinating is we perceive ourselves as learning by adding, but what's happening is learning by deletion.
Mm-hmm.
i.e.,
Yeah.
when you first hold a sword, you don't know what you could do with it. Therefore, all things are possible,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is why new people, when they're first fencing, do wild, crazy shit
Mm-hmm.
because they don't know what's happening. And they can't necessarily feel because they don't know what's relevant to feel.
Mm-hmm.
And so what begins to happen is you get rid of neural connections. You start tossing out anything that's crappy alignment. You're never
Mm-hmm.
going to let your wrist do this when you fence, right? Like all those parts go away.
Mm-hmm.
So our learning is a process of elimination.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think that's great.
Which is creepy.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So we're talking about feeling, we're talking about relaxation. So,
Yeah.
and what is relaxation? Relaxation is sort of this idea that we're going to sort of withhold the use of our internal processing power, right? Like my CPU, right?
Mm-hmm.
For these very specific things,
Right.
right? Like I'm looking for these very specific and a small number, and we want it to be as small as can be while still being sort of comprehensive, right? And robust. We want it to, like, we want the number of options to choose from to be exactly as, this is just elegance, right? This is in computer programming. It's like, we don't want lots of lines of code if one line of code will do the job, right?
Sure.
And then we want to use all of our processing power to just kind of be in the moment and feel and perceive those things, right? But we also still want our hard disk space, right? Our storage, our computer storage, to have like our technical library, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we can use our processing power to kind of pull from our technical library so that we can perform the appropriate technique or whatever.
Right. So in order to do that, you have to have a system.
Right. Whether it be articulated or not, you need
Correct.
something. Without, yeah, exactly. If it's literally just random, right? Then it would appear that way, right? Like we would know.
It would be like me playing chess.
Or me, right? Yeah. But so then what interests me about this conversation is that Fühlen, being present, right, that exists beyond just being involved in like a physical conflict, right?
Dude.
Being present and using Fühlen and working indes, like that's just like life, right?
Yeah.
And so that's like conversations.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, we've all been in a conversation with somebody who's a buffalo.
Well, and so in my view, like a buffalo fences without Fühlen, and
Right.
so sometimes that's the one who does all the talking, right?
Yeah.
But also a buffalo couldn't be a buffalo can just be perpetually weak, right? You can fence without Fühlen and just be weak all the time. You don't have to be strong all the time to not fence with Fühlen, right? And so we've all been in conversations with those people too.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's hard to know whether or not the person just is totally there but doesn't have anything to say,
Right.
or if they're there but not engaged, right? So
Right.
But
yeah.
Go ahead.
I had to like leave presence for a brief moment. Because if you recall, I was worried that we were going to have to cut our conversation short. But I just found out that my other obligations have gone away. So we have all the time we want.
Oh no.
So anyways, that distracted me momentarily and I lost the plot.
We'll get it back on the other end.
All right.
So yeah, well, so I guess I would like to hear more thoughts from you with regards to this idea that we use Fühlen, use being present, use sort of tethering ourselves to our relationships in a sort of shared flow state, right? In a
Yeah.
fencing bout, we're talking about with our training partner in life, just with the people that we commune with, right? And the, you know, the difference between, or rather how relaxation and sensitivity
Mm.
and not being up here, right, relates to all of that.
Yeah. Oh man, it so deeply relates to that. So relaxation is an interesting, like that's an interesting perspective. I don't disagree that you have to have that. But I think for many people, maybe not all, but for many people, a requirement to achieve relaxation is an assuredness of safety.
Mm.
And that's tricky to get in a combat sport, isn't it?
Mm.
Right? So how does one develop that? And so that's the piece that to me really expands out to the rest of your lived experience, right? Because your sense of safety depends a little bit on the people you're around, but mostly about your story about the people you're around.
For sure.
Right? So, I mean, all of this becomes, dude, there's a lot to dig in on. Yeah, so if we're going to focus back on not fencing and on taking Fühlen and indes into our daily life, right? I think seeking a state of relaxation is in part getting control well, okay, maybe that's a poor choice of words, but we'll stay with it. Getting control of your story, right? Because boy, oh boy, that little part of your brain that's keeping you alive is working really hard to keep you alive. Yeah. And by saying, let's project onto this person what you think is happening inside them so that you can predict what they're going to do so that you can stay alive. Yeah. And so our brain's going to be just going at that, right? And sometimes we develop a sense of safety with the people in our lives to the extent that that part can chill. Yeah. Until it's challenged, which it will be because we're all human and we fuck up.
Well, right. Well, but, or rather, you know, maybe to kind of stick with this metaphor, like, or, you know, we're looking for stability, not even metaphor. It's just like we're, you know, a way of framing it. We're looking for stability. We're looking for the ability to reliably predict
Yeah.
how our behavior, what the consequences of our behavior. Right. And so when you know, the easier it is for us to reliably predict the consequences of our behavior, I imagine the safer we will feel. Right. And when we feel blindsided,
Yeah.
that's when we lose our sense of safety.
Right. See, and that comes back to prediction.
Mm-hmm.
That's all prediction.
Right.
That's, I don't know. When I say to you, James, I really hate Ford trucks, right? My assumption is you don't give a shit about Ford trucks, right?
Yeah.
And that's perfectly safe to express that opinion to you, James, right?
Sure. Sure.
Maybe it would upset my dad a lot. Right?
Right.
And so making those assumptions and predictions is going to dictate what I verbally offer to you in the succession of our conversation.
Right. And I think as we, yeah. And so what happens when we lose that, right? What happens when we were confident that our behavior, when we were confident that our behavior was going to result in particular outcomes,
Right.
and then we get taken aback when we find that we screwed up.
Yeah.
And sometimes we put that on ourselves, and other times we put that on the circumstances or other people. And I'm actually interested. I would be interested to go down that road at some point. Like, I'm not sure I'm ready now, because this is like the first time I'm thinking about that.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
But I would say that in general, regardless of who we attribute or assign sort of responsibility to, or what we assign responsibility to, it definitely makes us feel more guarded.
Sure.
And what is more guarded, right? More guarded is stiff arming, right? More guarded is engaging our muscles in ways that maybe aren't appropriate for a flow state.
Right.
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 Um,
It also means that we aren't offering as much.
mm-hmm,
Yeah.
mm-hmm,
To put it in terms of fencing, sometimes fencers aren't comfortable and don't offer much, and it's therefore kind of boring to fence them
yeah. Yeah.
because there's that lack of play, right?
Yeah. Yes. So let's talk about that. So we were, so last week you hinted at this sort of Polyvagal deep dive that you were taking. And I'd like to hear more about what your thoughts on that framework are.
Oh yeah, the framework's really cool. Really cool. I'll have to just put a link in the description with regards to this little diagram I'm going to reference, because I honestly don't remember who created it, and that's trash. But anyways, I'll put the link. But there's kind of this thought about like that there are these states of being, meaning the way our brains are acting in the moment, right? And you can kind of have this sense of safety, right? Which is also where like our primary socialization is going to happen, right? You don't socialize with a bear, right? So there's kind of that, and that's a place where a lot of comfort is. This is the relaxation you're referencing, probably, right? And then of course we have fight or flight, which most everybody's super familiar with, and this is a very activated phase, where you're going to be doing something because of a perceived threat. And then there's kind of shutdown, which is you're not going to do anything because of a perceived threat, right? And that can be because it all just literally becomes too much and we play dead. Is the easiest way to think about it, right? And I'm totally not an expert on this, so this is just what I've taken in so far, right? So anybody that is an expert and is trained in this, sorry. But then there are these kind of mixed state ideas, right? And so play would be mixing, and I think this is the most important one for today, is play is mixing safety with the activation of fight flight, right? Which is why fencing can be so freaking thrilling, right? Because it is safe, and it is socialization, and it is exploration, but there's just enough danger to like get you going, right?
Sure. And maybe play is giving us a safe way to experience being blindsided.
Yeah. Okay. So you were talking about responsibility and you wanted to think about that, and that's fine. And I think we should think about it before we discuss. But I think the important part is if you are blindsided because something you didn't expect happened, the consequences have to not be catastrophic for you to stay in safety.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore be in a place of learning.
Mm-hmm.
If the consequences are catastrophic, you're probably going to shut down.
Mm-hmm.
Or drop to full
Right.
really fight time.
Right. And that this reminds me of trauma and how we, just to sort of draw out the extremes, right? So,
Yeah.
and lots of trauma, things are maybe we survived it, right? Maybe we enter into fight or flight. Maybe just we survived it because the circumstances were catastrophic, but not deadly. Right. But the bottom line is often we block it from our minds.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So there's no learning there at all. Right. Mm-hmm. So we know at least at the very extreme of what you're talking about, what you're saying is true. Right. So, mm-hmm. Or at least we don't consciously learn. Maybe we learn to just be super guarded all the time and learn that it's safer not to fence with Fühlen. Right.
We learn that this is a matter of life or death. Mm-hmm. I must not get there or else. Right.
Yeah.
And so the ways you choose not to get there are innumerable. Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
It might be you choose to let's go back to trucks because it's so ridiculous. It can't possibly reflect on anyone's real problematic situations, but
you get a bunch of hate comments in the what's wrong with Fords? God, podcast's so stupid.
Yeah, right. But like if I were to offhandedly make what to me was a lighthearted, playful joke about trucks, about Fords, and you were like, for real, like our friendship might be off now. I am so offended. Mm-hmm. And not only am I so offended, but I now am going to tell you you're a bad person because you brought that up in the first place. Mm-hmm. And you should carry shame and regret for what you did until you make it up to me. Right? Mm-hmm. I would, our relationship for me would immediately, irrevocably change.
For sure.
And I might never be able to let you back in.
Well, I'll tell you right now, that is 1,000% true in my life. I've experienced that, right?
Yeah.
Recently. We've all probably experienced it or whatever. We could all look back at our life and point to instances of where that may or may not be true. But I can point at very specific instances in my life that come fairly recently where people just overwhelmed me with a reaction that I wasn't expecting for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And it made it so that I will forever be guarded. In fact, I won't. It's going to be. I can't envision a world in which I won't be just so protected, so guarded that I could enter into that safe place with this person again or whatever, right? With that experience again. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting that the term play, I love that. I love the term play because I've done a lot of martial arts in practice.
Yeah.
Right. And fencing, for whatever reason, is probably the only one that that it's enculturated to conceive of so much of what we do as play, right? Yeah. For whatever reason, the historical fencing community look at our training as play. Right?
Yeah,
we call it play. We say free play. We don't. Some people use sparring a lot, right? But
even if we take it deadly seriously,
yeah,
we call it play.
Yeah, we do, and we're conscious. And I don't know if we're conscious of it. Certainly not all of us are familiar with Polyvagal theory, but
right.
But I think that it's apt to describe, imagine if there was real danger in our fencing exchanges, right?
Sometimes there is.
Then sometimes there is. But when there isn't, it gives us an opportunity to learn. It gives us an opportunity to sort of become more present, allow
Right.
ourselves to be blindsided in a way that we can reflect on.
Yeah.
And
Right. Because so this is I'm sorry to interrupt. Oh my God.
No,
But
please, I want more.
you just hit me so hard. Cause like there are times like I can picture moments. What immediately came to mind was fencing Jake Norwood. And like we were fencing with Messers and we happened to be in historical clothes and no masks. So, it was clearly play. It had to be play.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because no masks, you can't get real.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so we're fencing and we're screwing around and we're having a great time. And whenever one of us would hit the other one with something surprising, it would be peals of laughter out of whoever got hit.
Mm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
That was surprising and brilliant in the way that a witty joke is surprising and brilliant and tickles you and amuses you and fills you with joy. And you're like, damn, that was amazing. All right, let's try. Let's see if one of us can surprise the other one again.
Right.
Like playing peekaboo with a baby. Oh shit, there you are again.
Yeah.
It's amazing. So fun, right? But there are times where you get blindsided in the negative sense. When you're fencing somebody and they take your face off and you never saw it coming and it concussed you and, or whatever, there was a catastrophic outcome.
Right.
And that's where we get to the heart of, do I now put that fencer that did that to me in the unsafe category, or do I put fencing in the unsafe category?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's, because blindsided can be hilarious fun. And it can be terrible.
Right. Right. Well, and it's particularly if we build a context in which we can feel the safety of, whatever it is that we're experiencing, to be sure that even as things happen that are outside of my control, that are unexpected, that I'm using to sort of guide my learning, that I'm not going to be hurt by them. Right. So something that's interesting to me is, or what I started to do after we talked about that a little bit, right? Fleshed out this polyvagal stuff and this idea of play. Is I started to think about when I use the term play, like because as I said, in all of my martial practice, I've never used the term play so much to describe what I'm doing until historical fencing. But when I would have used the term play otherwise would have been, to describe what my kids are doing. Right. So, and what are they doing? They're going out to play. Right. What does that mean, really? Right. So if you would have asked me several years ago, or even if you would have asked me just recently, I might have said something like, they're going out to have fun, not care. Right. I don't know how I would describe it, but that's very clearly not what they're doing, right? Like what play is they're exploring beyond their boundaries.
Safely.
Right? So, safely, right? Exactly. They're exploring beyond their boundaries. They're experiencing things that they don't have a map for. Right? Why? So that they can begin to draw out their map. Right? And sometimes that's just like drawing a picture or whatever. right?
Yeah.
They're learning, fine motor skills, and not just fine motor skills, but they're like learning how to apply their imagination to a visual media or whatever. Or it could be they're in the woods with their friends playing hide and seek or just whatever. And most often, so sometimes people get hurt, but most often it's not the kind of catastrophic hurt that would, but also like it helps us find those hard limits, right? Like, okay,
Yeah.
no, I don't want to play this game because I know I'm going to get hurt.
Right. Or social limits of somebody will say, I don't want to play with you because you're playing too hard.
Yeah.
Or whatever, right?
Or whatever, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, okay. I don't know what kind of a parent you were when you had littles, right? When they were little.
Mm-hmm.
But I was quite passionate about every piece of it because I'm me and, whatever. And so I got weirdly passionate about playground design.
That's awesome.
When I had an 18-month-old running around, right? And so, we can all look at like those vintage pictures of like a freaking concrete, and there's like a terrible metal structure, and there's kids hanging like a foot, or a story up in the air, and you're like, oh my God, how did they all not die?
Right.
Meanwhile, now we have very safe playgrounds that are empty. So what happened is we took away the ability to have risk, right?
Right.
We build these safe playgrounds for 7-year-olds who are more than physically big enough and mentally big enough to determine their own safety. They will self-limit. They will only climb as high as they feel comfortable, right? But now we made it safe, and it goes up real high, and they go through the bars and the face plant on the ground, right? Because there's this perception of safety that isn't real. And so then they take insane risks and do nutso stuff, or they never even show up to it because it isn't fun.
Right.
So it's like, if there were only dangerous ways to get high, you wouldn't have to stand over your 18-month-old and micromanage everything they do. But instead, we made safe ways for them to get high, so they will go beyond their reasonable capabilities.
Yeah, sure.
Are you with me?
Yeah. I mean, and so that brings me back to fencing, right?
Yes.
So, which is our responsibility as fencers, our responsibility as teachers. What environments are we trying to create? Right? We want to create environments where people can safely explore their boundaries.
Yep.
That it just dawned on me, we haven't even, so we're already talking about like safety gear and HEMA, right?
No, we're not.
Okay. You could take this down that road, right? Like you could take this down that road.
We could be talking about the perception of safety created by putting something on your body, right?
Yeah. And we all know where that conversation leads. So let's just assume it done. Right?
We'll point you to a number of threads on the internet if you've never thought about this.
Right. So, but yeah, so like, how do we create contexts? How do we create shared expectations amongst fencers that gives them a safe way to explore beyond their boundaries, beyond our boundaries, right? And should we always be concerned about exploring beyond our boundaries? Should we ever allow ourselves or allow ourselves to put others into the deep end of the pool, right?
Oh boy. I mean, it takes Fühlen to know, yeah?
Sure. Yeah, that's right. There's an art. There is an
Yeah,
art to to knowing, teaching and learning is its own art,
yeah,
right? To knowing what I need, right? Do I need to be in the deep end of the pool? In a sense, is it a deep end of the pool at all, right? Is in a sense, if I know that's what I need, then isn't that just sort of on the periphery of my boundaries, right? Or I don't
exactly.
know.
Exactly. Right. And like, certainly, I've had people come to train with me that I have encouraged to go to other clubs that I thought would give them what they wanted to explore.
Mm,
That I could say, I'm not capable of giving you what you want to explore due to the limits of my ability to teach. Right.
hmm
And I don't have to take that um, personally for myself or feel bad
mm,
about myself. Um,
right.
and it doesn't like, oh my God, it's so easy to like start throwing pejoratives about those
Mm,
situations, right? Either about the fencer
mhm.
or about yourself. Um, but I don't think it should be, right?
No.
Like, listen, you put me on a tilt-a-whirl, I'm going to puke.
hmm
Like, there is no boundary to explore there for me. It is not fun.
Yeah.
I'm just going to puke all over everybody, right? So, like, why, but dude, like, if you love the tilt-a-whirl, I'm not going to like tell you you're a bad person for
Right. Right.
it.
Right.
Get on
And
that
so
ride.
yeah, and so again, it's about story begets state, right? So,
Mhm.
and it's about the story we. It's not just about the story that we construct about what is happening or what has happened, right? But it's about the narrative we are on, right? Like our own destination, understanding what it is that we're looking for from anything, whether it be um, fencing or otherwise, right? So,
Could you say more? Because I just got very still. Like, you said something really important there, and I'd like you to say more about that.
okay, so I guess where I'm going with this is like it could. All right, so just in fencing, right? We're all doing this. We have various ways of thinking about what we're doing.
Yeah.
Um, eventually we're gonna have to get into the nitty gritty about what martial arts are, right?
Sure.
Um, you know, uh, but I think we all tell ourselves at least some kind of story about what martial arts are and why we are choosing to do martial arts. Like, why did we choose sword combat? You know, it's
Right?
an it's an absurd thing, right? Is it because we have a sort of a deep connection to like our childhood aesthetic, or like, or is it because we want to learn how to survive on the streets or whatever, right? Like, um, and that's gonna inform our practice, right? That's like our sense of what it is that we're trying to achieve with this is going to not just um, inform our perspective, but it should inform the way in which we experience the art, right?
Yeah.
The way we design our own path.
Hmm.
Um, and so, you know, so one of the things that we're kind of contending with is this idea of community,
Sure.
right? So we exist in this community of historical fencers, and what does it mean to be a part of it, right?
Mm.
Is historical fencing playing with swords? Is it competing in tournaments? Is it looking at sources? Is it having a narrative in which you are a swordsman or a swordswoman?
Right.
Um, is it, and so given your own narrative about what it is that you're doing with this is the community, right? The community may be closed off to you, right?
Yeah.
And so you may have to sort of, I mean, and so is it a symbiotic relationship that we're in with the community? Do we, it certainly is, right? But at what point do we have to just accept that maybe we share dissimilar perspectives or outlooks? And
well, I think that's a macro version of, me sending somebody to train somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So in order to fence, you have to have community, because otherwise you're just doing solo drills in your backyard.
Right. Well, and yeah, right.
Which is cool. Like, no shade.
Right.
But in order to find Fühlen, you have to have somebody to find it with. So by default, there becomes a community. But there is all the levels. There is the community that you create with who you're fencing with right in that moment. There is the community that you create within the club that you typically train in. And then it can become regional and worldwide, right? And so, yeah. So there are decision points where you can say, my engagement stops at this circle, and everything outside that circle is not of interest to me.
And we deal with a pressure though. And so that would be, I think, something worth talking about, is like the pressure that we feel about whether or not what we're doing is okay, or meets the criteria for being a part of this movement, such as it is, right? Right. Because so certainly at this point in my life, I don't feel any pressure by that. Right. But there's a lot of reasons why I don't feel any pressure about that. And part of it might just be because I've already gone through that process. Right. Part of it, might be because I've achieved some sense of, how do I put it? Like, I've gotten the acceptance of the community writ large. Right.
That's a part of it.
So it is a part of it. And so maybe like me saying, well, you just kind of find yourself, right? Maybe that's harder than it sounds, right? So there's something else that you said that I want to go back to, which is the idea that Fühlen is a social, it's a social experience, right?
Yeah. Well,
or you're dealing with external. So Fühlen is always going to be like external and internal, right? So like we're trying to process external data, right? But I think you take it a step beyond that in a sort of more fundamental way. You take it a step beyond that when you say like the external data that we're getting is someone else's sort of personhood, right? Like someone else, it's another human whom we are trying to get inside of. We're trying to get in the pocket of, or trying to get, in the experience of. Yeah. Because it's not, it's partly it's their spirit that guides their behavior.
Sure.
Right? And so in order for us to be able to learn to predict what we can expect from another person, we have to, like, in a very, very deep and visceral way, like meld with them, right? We have to
hopefully.
Right.
Commune.
Or not. We could just, we could just flail, right? Right. But that, and again, so like, winning about, right? But for me, it's about achieving this sort of flow state, the shared flow state.
Yeah.
Right. So like, what fencing is for me, as in fencing as in life, right, is like achieving this sort of shared flow state that comes from my humanity and that of my training partner. Right. This is social process.
Yeah.
Right. where I don't just feel, I'm not just feeling physically, I'm not just feeling someone else's meat shell,
Right.
right? Right. But I'm feeling all of their humanity,
Mm.
you know. And actually this reminds me of something we were talking about, you know, art and science, and how like we're using science to inform our art,
Yeah.
but science doesn't govern our art, right?
Right.
And why is that? And the reason that science doesn't govern our art is because humans are more complicated than science, right? The decision making process for a human is not bound by science. And so our art in entering into an exchange with another person can't be dependent on them making what we call, like, you know, rational decisions. Sometimes the correct art, the correct application of art is something that's not particularly scientific.
Absolutely. And even more so, or more to me more pointedly, we aren't robots. We aren't a series of if then statements.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot like that metaphor for thinking has become so dominant and powerful in American culture, at least, that it blinds us to what is actually freaking happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because we're demanding that this if then statement works out the way it was written, with and so therefore we are predicting it will, so therefore we are looking to see it happen, and therefore we're stiff arming and not actually
Being
feeling
present.
anything outside our own wishful thinking, I'll put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Because I mean, we all think so differently, and the one
For
thing
sure.
we definitely know is that we don't know what the other person's thinking.
No.
We're
No,
predicting like mad, but we have no clue.
Right. So there's a couple of things. I think I was watching, I don't know what happened that I ended up getting interested in basketball of all things.
Yeah.
Dude. But
I think we've shared some Michael Jordan videos before.
we did. Well, right. So yeah,
we
so however it happened, like I'm all of a sudden like interested in basketball. And I've literally watched more basketball in the last, let's say, 2 months than I have in my entire life ever. Right. Even growing up in New York City, right, when I was playing basketball all the time, I was totally detached from the experience. Right. I didn't even understand what I was doing in those moments when I was playing basketball. But like now all of a sudden I'm like interested in it or whatever. So I'm watching these highlights 2 days ago, and I thought, man, I wish that I could like rip this video and figure out how we can like share it on you know the stream or whatever, like, and we'll figure that out at some point.
send it to me. I can totally do it.
It was this perfect other, you know, we'll link it this time because I think it's worth it, right?
Yeah.
It's a basketball player, so it's a fast break, right? And and there's one defender and there's two like the ball handler, and then there's someone down in the post, right?
Okay.
So it's a fast break happening. The defender is on the ball handler the whole way, right?
Yeah.
The ball handler basically, you know, goes, I don't know, he basically takes the sort of the right side of the lane, and it looks like he's going for a layup, and he dishes it to the post player.
Yeah.
And the defender, it was magic, right? Because the defender was tethered to the ball, right? He was, well, not just the ball, but he was tethered to the experience of the ball handler, right?
Yeah.
He was, and so he was tracking with the long edge. It was gorgeous. He follows the dish and blocks the shot from the guy in the post.
Yeah.
You know, and you could just see the whole time he's just like, you know, it's not a layup. If it was a layup, it's not clear to me that if it was a layup that he would have been able to block it, but it just seemed like he was so indes. He was feeling that situation perfectly. He was so present in what was going on that as the ball handler made the pass, he just followed it as though it was the long edge tracking the opponent's blade, and and he was right there for the block. And he stopped this fast break. It was just he single-handedly stopped this fast break, and it was just because he was so in the pocket of what was going on.
Yeah.
Right. How did I get there?
I don't know.
No.
Yeah. We've talked long enough. We've completely lost it.
Yeah. Well, so for whatever reason, so I apparently all I can think to say is that you can work into playing basketball.
Oh, yes.
There's an I'm cashed. I can't think of anything else.
It's out. Well, okay. So, I mean, we are wrapping up, but what occurs to me about that is, of course, you can be indes playing basketball, right? I mean, we've already thrown out the proposition you can be indes a conversation, right? Or at least be present and feeling in the conversation, right? And feeling is indes, right? As weird as that is, which is a whole thing. But I think the thought I would want to leave on, and then maybe we come back to maybe next week, I don't know, is from that basketball example. You said it wasn't clear to you if the shot had been real, if the layup had been real, that this person would have gotten there, but it never was real. So he didn't need to be there.
Sure.
Had it been real, if he was as in the groove as you perceive him to be, he would have been there.
Sure.
Right. And so that's the stuff that gets really crazy in fencing when you start playing with feints, because in effect that was a feint, right? He didn't eat it. He didn't believe it. Right. And that's what my judo instructor always said. If you're going to feint, you better make him believe it.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So I have to somehow get you to tell a story that's not right, that isn't real and never was real. So how do I get you to predict something I have no intention of creating? That's going to be so good.
Right. Well, so it does bring us back to what is this art that we're doing? Is we're not just playing with a robot, right? That's what the art is, right? The art is we're trying to learn to exercise some degree of control, we'll say, for lack of a better word, over a training partner in this case, who has their own story, right?
And maybe you do have to achieve that symbiosis or that shared state that you seek in order to effectively write them the wrong story. I don't know, but that's for next time, man.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the chats today.
Yeah, it was great. And, we look forward to seeing, the rest of you next week.
Yeah. And maybe if you're enjoying this, throw us who should get on and chat with us about some of this stuff, because it doesn't always have to be just James and I. Other people could join us. I don't know. All
right. And also, hey, like and subscribe, yo. We're trying to get famous. All right.
Anyways, bye, y'all.